Do USMLE scores predict patient care outcomes? This is a YouTube channel that I actually really like. It's called The Sheriff of Sodium. It's by Dr. Carmody. I believe he's a pediatric hospitalist. It looks like he's a pediatric nephrologist. But anyways, he does all these kind of next level kind of meta videos on the state of medical education and medical training in general. So you can see some of his videos. This one we want to look at, do USMLE scores really predict patient care outcomes? But he's done like Match Day 2024, Winners and Losers, Death of a Program, ACGME versus Private Equity, and even these ones, Battle for Clinical Training Sites or Pediatric Subspecialty Shortage. Anyways, today I'm going to take a look at this video and I want to see what he has to say about USMLE scores predicting patient care outcomes. And what do you think? What do you think the research is going to show?
Another Sheriff of Sodium video. Today, we're going to discuss whether higher USMLE scores really predict patient care outcomes. Here's the article I'm going to discuss. The Association Between USMLE Performance and Outcomes of Patient Care by Norsini et al., which was published in March 2024 in Academic Medicine. But actually, it came out online some months before that, and when it did, I read it, and then I tried my best to ignore it in the hopes that others would too. But after the print edition came out, sometime by late March, I had seen enough congratulatory and non-critical social media discussion about this article that I decided that this was probably something the Sheriff of Sodium needed to talk about.
I love this. I just love his intro already. But anyways, this is like definitely a very spicy journal article, and their conclusion you can see is better provider USMLE performance was associated with lower in-hospital mortality and shorter log length of stay for patients, although the magnitude of the latter is unlikely to be of practical significance. These findings add to the body of evidence that examines the validity of the USMLE licensure program. And this is probably, again, going to be talking a lot about the debate about whether Step 1 should be pass-fail or not. It looks like this used USMLE Step 1, Step 2 CK, and Step 3 scores. And the adjusted odds ratio was 0.94 for in-hospital mortality, with a confidence interval of 0.90 to 0.99. So that's like the bare minimum that they could have gotten for this to be a significantly different result. Obviously, if the confidence interval included 1, then this would not have been significant. But their p-value was less than 0.02. So very interested to hear what his take is on this journal article. But I can definitely see how this would have ruffled a lot of feathers.
I want to start by briefly summarizing the article so that we're all on the same page and everyone begins with a reasonable foundation about what the paper says. The objective here is to determine whether there's an association between physician performance on the USMLE and outcomes of patient care. And in theory, that's a pretty simple thing to do. All we really need are 4 things. We need a big data set of doctors and patients, and then we need the USMLE performance of the doctors, and we need the clinical outcomes of the patients. And then once we have those things, all we'll need is just a little bit of math to decide whether those things are actually associated with.
So one of the things I'm already seeing, first of all, did they get consent for all of these doctors to have their USMLE scores involved in this study? That's the first thing I'm wondering. And then 2, clinical outcomes, okay? And then using math. So this entirely, at least my initial impression, is this totally gets into is this just correlation? Is this causation? Like, you can't definitively say that higher scores on the USMLE will lead to better patient care outcomes. Like, it's not a direct link. There may be an association, but it's hard to prove that it's directly linked.
To get a big data set of doctors and patients, the authors used the Pennsylvania Healthcare Cost Containment Council's data set, which is called PHC4. Every time that a patient gets discharged from a hospital in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the hospital has to send certain data about that patient and their hospitalization to the PHC4. And those data include what the patient was in the hospital for, how long they stayed, whether they survived or passed away, and who the attending physician of record was. Of course, there's a lot of different types of hospitals in Pennsylvania, and they care for lots of different people who end up in the hospital for lots of different reasons. So to make things a little simpler and facilitate cleaner comparisons, the authors decided to focus only on patients that were admitted for one of 5 common medical conditions. Those were acute myocardial infarction, heart failure, stroke, pneumonia, and COPD. And they did this for patients who were hospitalized over a 3-year period from January of 2017 to December of 2019, so they'll avoid any effects of the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think I roughly agree with their decision to narrow down the diagnoses to a certain set. And those are very common diagnoses, and they're associated with high morbidity and high mortality. So I do think it's reasonable that they did that.
There's also a lot of different types of doctors in Pennsylvania. And so, again, to facilitate a more natural comparison, the authors decided to focus only on generalists and exclude specialists and subspecialists. So what they did is they used the AMA Physician Master File to limit their analysis only to physicians who self-identified as being a family medicine physician or a general internal medicine physician. If you described yourself as being anything other than that, you're out. And then, among this group, they excluded physicians who held a board certification in anything other than internal medicine or family medicine. Sound good so far? So now we got a big...
Don't you guys love just his presentation style? I feel like it's just so entertaining to listen to, and it's a really nice way to read about what they discussed in the paper.
Data set of doctors and patients, and now we just need the USMLE scores and the clinical outcomes and the math, and then we'll be cooking. So to measure USMLE performance, the authors created a composite measure that averaged the performance on the doctor's first attempt at the USMLE Step 1, Step 2 CK, and Step 3 examinations. So instead of having to do math with 3 different numbers, now we just have one. And that number, it's actually a z-score that expresses how far from the overall mean of performance that doctor's Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3 scores were.
One thing I could see being a problem here is that Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3, people do not take at the same level of intensity, right? Step 1, at least for all of these people who were taking the graded version of Step 1, would have definitely taken the massive priority. But people have varying levels of effort for Step 2 CK and Step 3. I didn't do really any dedicated studying for Step 2 CK or Step 3. Whereas Step 1, everybody does 6 to 8 weeks or whatever of dedicated studying, and that's the one you really try the hardest for. So I'm not totally sure I would have included Step 2 CK and Step 3 in a composite score. That being said, Step 2 CK and Step 3 are both much more clinically focused, whereas Step 1 is only kind of like basic science, more basic science focused. And so it makes sense to include the more, clinically focused exams as well. So I wonder what you guys would have thought about including a composite score or doing subgroup analysis or just doing one of these step exams, for example.
So now we need the clinical outcomes, and the authors chose 2 from the PHC4 dataset. They decided to use in-hospital mortality, and then for patients who survived a discharge, length of stay. And these are pretty good outcomes because...
I was actually about to say the same. I like that they chose these outcomes because they're objective. There's nothing that's potentially easy to finagle about it to like make it prove one certain set of data or another. For example, a lot of people do these composite outcomes of hospitalization and readmission rate and stroke and blah, blah, blah. And then by creating a composite outcome, they can really obscure what actually was driving their data. So by having very discrete and objective data, it makes the data a little bit more trustworthy.
Mortality certainly matters to patients, and length of stay is probably pretty important too. And both of these outcomes are objectively defined and resistant to bias. And now that we have all these things, all that's left for us to do is some math to see if there's an association between USMLE performance and the clinical outcomes. Thing is, USMLE scores can't be the only thing that impacts whether a patient lives or dies or how long they're going to be in the hospital. So the authors decided to include a number of other variables in the model that might impact mortality and length of stay so that they could better isolate the effects of the physician's USMLE scores. So, for instance...
So this I do not like because they are adding so much extra variables here that it becomes very easy for the data to be manipulated and changed in a certain way to prove a certain point. What you really should do, in my opinion, is to keep the study simple and let the numbers, the sample size, do the power for you and to help you get rid of the need to control all these factors. If you have a large enough sample size, then the different patient characteristics should on average start to average out. And you'll see those table one baseline characteristics of group 1 versus group 2 in like the New England Journal of Medicine, for example. And it will show that their randomization was actually good. It was effective, and that all patients were pretty much the same in both groups. They had similar baseline characteristics. That's the benefit of having a large sample size. Now, this isn't a randomized controlled trial. This is more of kind of like a retrospective cohort kind of trial. But this is just a lot of potential for manipulation here.
And once they'd done all that, here's what they found. When you look at mortality, the higher the doctor's USMLE performance was, the more likely their patients were to make it out of the hospital alive. The adjusted odds ratio for mortality was 0.95. So for every 1 unit increase in USMLE performance, there was a 5% decrease in the odds of in-hospital mortality. Now let's look at length of stay. And again, when you look at how long a patient will be hospitalized for one of these 5 common medical conditions, again we see that the higher the doctor's USMLE scores, the shorter their patients were staying in the hospital. Now here the adjusted odds ratio was 0.99. So the effect size wasn't quite as large as for mortality, but look at that p-value. It's just 0.001. So you know this is really good.
That was very sarcastic, the way that he said that, because you can have a very significant p-value, but if in a real life scenario this doesn't actually make a meaningful difference, then the p-value is irrelevant, right? Say your treatment improves the mortality of a patient by 0.0005%, and your p-value is off the charts, like super significant, but your actual change in the patient's mortality is negligible, right? So in this case, the change in the length of stay is negligible, right? And that's why he's poking fun at this.
And if you like those results and you don't see any flaws in this study design, well, this is probably a good place for you to stop watching this video. Just go ahead and hit the retweet button, or make an uncritical comment about what a cool result this is, or actually, you can just sit back in the privacy of your own home and let that tiny little sweet burst of dopamine hit your mesolimbic system, because you remember how good your USMLE scores were, and deep down inside you've always thought that you weren't like other doctors, and now, by God, there's the proof. And
this guy's so funny. This is why I love his videos, dude. And he's only got 6,000 subscribers because he covers such niche topics that people don't know about him, right? But I highly encourage you guys to check out his YouTube channel.
Want to do any of that? Then please don't let me spoil it for you. We can just part ways, and you can go watch something else that confirms your priors. But if you keep watching, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work back across some of the ground that we've already covered together, but we're going to take a closer and a more critical look at some of the things about this paper, and by the end, I'm going to do my level best to make sure that you have a different opinion about this paper. I'm going to start with a few softballs. Let's go back to the very beginning. Here again is the paper, only now highlighted in red are the authors, and all of them work for the National Board of Medical Examiners. The funding for this study came from examinees' registration fees for the USMLE.
Bias.
Is that a problem? Not necessarily. Does that by itself mean that the results shown are untrue? Certainly not. But it does mean that there's a financial conflict of interest, and we should look at this paper with the same degree of skepticism that we would if it were a clinical trial of a new medication that was sponsored by the pharmaceutical company. The people who designed the study and collected the data and did the statistical analysis, they benefit financially if the study turns out a certain way, and they don't benefit if it turns out another. Now,
I absolutely love this, because one of the first things that you should do whenever looking into a paper, especially one that's making a very, very grandiose claim, is to figure out who funded the study. Are there any potentials for bias? And could that explain some kind of ulterior motive for the results that were presented?
pointing out that a financial conflict of interest exists. It is not an allegation of research misconduct. Conflict of interest is a condition, not a behavior. It just means that we need to look closely at whether all the decisions that got made are the decisions that a reasonable person who didn't have a stake in the outcome would have made. So let's start to look at some of those decisions together. I said at the beginning that this was a pretty simple study. We only needed 4 things, right? But this is probably a pretty good place to point out that one of those things is something that only a small and very select group of people have access to, and that's the USMLE scores. The work that was done here simply cannot be replicated by any other group of researchers outside of the National Board of Medical Examiners because no one else has access to every physician's USMLE scores. Sure, you could try to do a study where you ask doctors what their USMLE scores were, and you can see how far you get.
Yeah, see, I was curious about this. I was wondering how they obtained all this information.
And if you need a tutorial and recall bias, non-response bias, or selection bias, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and try to replicate that study in such a manner, and go ahead and send it out to some reviewers and see what they have to say. The only people in the whole wide world who could do this study are the very ones who did it. And out of all the possible studies that they could have published, this is the one they published. I also want to point out that at no point in the manuscript did the authors state that they had filed a statistical analysis plan somewhere before they began collecting or analyzing data.
That is very important because a high quality study defines what they're going to do from the outset, and they don't modify that. So if you do not define what you're going to do at the outset, and you're just collecting this data, well, you're allowing yourself to just modify things or change your statistical analysis so that you can prove the point that you're trying to prove. So the fact that you did not, from the outset, make a clear definition of how you were going to statistically analyze the study just means that you're allowing yourself to just randomly change variables down the line so you can get the results that you want.
And that's become the standard for certain types of high-stakes research, like clinical trials, because even in a very simple study, the investigators have to make lots of decisions. How are you going to measure the variables? How are you going to analyze the outcomes? How are you going to adjust for confounders? And the answers to all those questions, they determine the result that you're going to get. Let me give you one interesting example of how this process can play out. 10 years ago, a group of researchers decided to investigate racism among soccer referees. They wondered if darker-skinned players might be more likely to get red cards and get ejected from the game by the referee than lighter-skinned players. So what they did is they assembled a data set of professional soccer players and referees in Europe, and they included all the red cards that every player had received. And they included lots of other data that might potentially be relevant, like the league they were playing in, or the player's position, or even the country of origin for the referee. But then they found 29 other research groups, and they gave them this data set that they'd built. And they asked each of those groups to build a model and decide if referees were more likely to give red cards to darker-skinned players. Here's what happened. Out of the 29 research groups, no group built the same regression model. Actually, there was significant diversity even in the basic analytic approach. And again, these are all professional statisticians and researchers using the same data set. It just goes to show how many degrees of freedom researchers have when they're answering even a simple question. And most of the ways that they could do it are logical and defensible.
This is a great analogy. I did not know about this at all. This is so interesting, so randomly interesting, right?
This study, but now we're going to add a 30th research team. And this research team is going to be composed of professional soccer referees. Where do you think their model is going to fall on this forest plot? Because if you just make decisions as you go along, and option A and option B both seem somewhat reasonable ways of doing things, you're going to be tempted, even unconsciously, to choose the one that makes your effect size the largest and your p-value the smallest in the direction that you think things ought to go. So let's take a look at some of the analytic decisions that the authors made, and let's see what you think. Let's start small, and we'll build to ones that I think are increasingly problematic.
So I went ahead and actually finished the whole video because I feel like you don't need to sit here listening to me give all the points that he gives. He actually gives a lot of more nuanced and interesting points later down in the video. So I highly encourage you guys go to his YouTube channel to check out the video in full. And honestly, I just really want to say that it's the way he presents things is just such an entertaining way to examine literature. And it really shows a lot of the downsides of research and how we have to be very skeptical of a lot of the research that's out there. And there's even some comments in that video saying, man, I wish all journal clubs were like this. But really, there's so many points that he brings up. It's actually kind of impressive just how many errors he can find with this single paper. So again, I highly recommend you guys check out his YouTube channel and that video. Also check out his other videos as well. Really an incredibly awesome channel that I love listening to. And I hope you guys head over there and get some enjoyment out of it as well. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and peace.